Welcome back, guys. We're going to pick up where we left off in this attempt to explain some of the lesser-known history of our country, specifically the battle that's always existed with subversive enemies like secret societies, foreign nations, big banks, etc. And last episode, we left off with the Civil War and the Act of 1871. Probably the climax of all of this, right? And we talked about the narrative of slavery, of course, and we'll be reading today some words of Jefferson Davis, which are very important, something I didn't know, and he speaks about how right before the war, well, in the decades before the war, the North sold all of their slaves to the South. And he gives reason for this, and he's going to tell, the half of the story that the textbooks don't tell, that we don't learn about today, because the winners write history, right? So we talked about that. We talked about the ideology of each section, of each, the Union and Confederacy, how the Union was really a product of the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, false Christianity, lots of ecumenical organizations like Freemasonry and everything that's associated with that, industrious and power hungry. And they were toiling with corporations, as Charles Francis Adams wrote about in 1868, I believe it was. And corporations back then were not accepted like they were today. And these guys were starting to create these invisible entities that would soon come to dominate. This whole episode we're doing today is going to be dominated by the corporation and the bank. So we talked about how the South, I was actually just listening to some Confederate music, and it said, "Down with the eagle, up with the cross." And that explains it perfectly. The eagle, while being a patriotic symbol normal to us, is actually the symbol of ancient Rome, the Holy Roman Empire, Nazi Germany. It's on the crest of all these powerful families, right? And in the 1916 convocation of the Rose Cross Order, they actually associated the eagle with Egypt. So it's a Mystery Babylon symbol. And of course, Freemasonry with a double-headed eagle. And, what those guys were singing about is down with all of that and up with the cross, up with Christianity. So I think it's certainly a fact that the South was more true to the faith than the North. And we lost that. We lost also the Jeffersonian, political idea of individualism, rugged individualism, agrarian lifestyle, real freedom. And, we didn't only lose that, we literally lost half of the house. We were a house divided, and then one house suffered military defeat, one half of that house, right? So the Union took full power, and they occupied the South, and it gave them the political freedom they needed to advance some of the things that affect our life to this day, banks, corporations, etc. It wasn't without dispute. There were it broke off, and there were different factions in the Union and, politics in the North in general, but they were able to do what they needed to do. So we're going to start with a survey work. We looked at it before. It's called The Growth of Industrial Enterprise. It's from 1961. It's written by Lance Davis. Looks like it was probably in a college class requirement or something. And we're going to talk about some of the benefits of this change and some of the costs of this change. And like I said, so much happens in this period, and it's all focused around money, and it's all focused around the federal government. So much bureaucracy you're going to learn about today, and this is all when it really jumped off. If you look at the screen, these are pictures of New York City. This is from 1888. Take a look at what life looked like back then. So as you can imagine, this is in stark contrast to what the South was like. This is crazy. Look at that. Look at all those wires. Here's another one from 1889. Thousands and thousands of wires, right? So you have to imagine people in the South often could go their whole life without ever like interacting with the federal government. They were like truly free. There was so much land and it was an agrarian economy. It was very, very different. Very, very, very different. In this society, in the Union, we're beginning to see kind of like the lifestyle we live today. The rise of the city, the rise of the corporation and the banks, and all of a sudden the people are completely reliant on this sort of system, and self-sufficiency is out the window. So I want to show you just a little bit of what it looked like back then and how much it changed in that short time after the war. Okay, so I think we're pretty familiar with the benefits of this industrial growth, right? We all live very comfortable lives. Take a look at this graph. So the bottom part, the dashed part, is farming, and the top is non-farming. This is basically the displaying the growth. Let me read it. Keep that in mind. See how the dashed line doesn't really change, but that line, the bold one at the top, rapidly changes? What this is displaying is changes in the labor force. So from 1860 to 1920, the labor force for things non-farm related jumped from 10 million to 42 million, while the agrarian one, the farming, really only moved about 5 million over that course of time, 60 years. So post-Civil War America exploded with manufacturing, with industry, corporations, banks. So let's see what this author writes about the cost of growth. From an economic viewpoint, the years between the wars were successful. National output increased from 9 billion to 70 billion, and even though population was increasing rapidly, output per person rose from $220 to $710. Moreover, during the last part of the period, income was not only rising, but was becoming more equally distributed as well. Karl Marx had predicted that capitalism would fail because the rich would get richer. In the United States, the rich got richer, but the poor got richer even faster. However, economic change is not without cost. Not everyone's position improved, and some who were better off objected to the social and political changes that resulted. The period was, therefore, marked by periodic complaints against the costs of growth, and at times these complaints were translated into social and political action. Three major effects were particularly strongly felt. Increasing specialization meant greater total output, but it also meant that each person was more dependent on the new impersonal market forces that set wages for work and prices for goods. Consumers benefited in lower prices resulting from the new technology, but falling prices also increased the burden of debt. People owed the same amount of money, but more goods and services had to be produced to pay off the debt. The larger market area sometimes increased the amount of competition, and at times, businessmen found their profit margins squeezed. And we have another graph here. It's the gross national product per capita, and it's from the years 1869 to 1921. And it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, I believe. And I'll just show you what the image looks like here. So you can see at the top is 1920, and it's skyrocketed by then. So a giant increase in gross national product. This section now is going to talk about the problems of agriculture. So let's see what happened to agriculture. Remember, half of the country was self-sufficient agrarian lifestyle. Perhaps no single group complained more, wow, that's a weird word, vociferously about the injustices of the economic system than did the American farmers. Specialization had increased the farmers' potential profits, but these profits were largely determined by the cost of transportation services and the prices offered by the world commodity markets. Of these markets, he had little understanding and less control. At the same time, many farmers had borrowed heavily to improve and expand their farms, and as debtors, they felt the pinch of falling prices. So, as you can imagine, the barons, right? So your train barons, especially, we'll be reading about them today and about some of the practices they applied to transporting things across the country. Okay, there's a subheading, and it's called the Grange Movement. We're going to talk about that as well, and let's read what they have to say. In the 1870s, through the Granges, farmers attempted to organize to fight the forces they so little understood. They wanted to legislate control over the railroads and other alleged monopolies, which they believed were responsible for their problems. At first, they achieved some success. They were able to elect state governments in many of the farm states, and these rural legislators responded with a series of laws regulating rates charged by railroads, grain elevators, and other utilities of particular concern to the farmer. Although these actions were frequently opposed by the regulated firms, the Supreme Court at first upheld the right of states to regulate utilities. And remember, I said they didn't have completely free political reign in the North. They still had, fragmented opposition parties, right? And we'll be learning about that. Okay, in this instance, the landmark decision was Munn versus Illinois, 1876. Later, however, in the Wabash case, 1886, the courts held that interstate commerce, including the interstate portions of interstate lines, was outside the jurisdiction of the state legislators. Actually misread, so let me read that again, because this is important. So in 1886, the courts held that interstate commerce, including the intra-state portions of interstate lines, was outside the jurisdiction of the state legislators. Quite an astonishing change, right, in policy. So this is the result of the Act of 1871. This is what you're going to start seeing. Huge government overreach, always justified as beneficial to the people, right? Think about that. The states before could govern themselves and decide what taxes they would impose on the trains and, all sorts of stuff. But in 1886, the federal government reversed its earlier decision to uphold that and said, no, now the federal government is going to be in charge of all of this interstate transportation of goods. And who is the federal government funded by? The robber barons, right? Just like today, the Bill Gates. The shift in responsibility from state to national levels was more than the farmers could cope with, and the first protest movements collapsed. The farmers were still an effective political force in the farm states, but their problems were now national rather than local. This is basically just they just pulled a Versailles Treaty with the Confederacy, pretty much. They destroyed the South, and this is a very honorific way of describing that. National politics. Let's read about this. In an attempt to develop an effective program, the farmers turned to national politics. In the 80s, many Southern farmers joined the Southern Alliance, later the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union. Their Western counterparts affiliated themselves with the National Alliance. Although the two differed slightly in their approach, both saw the need for a national political program. In the election of 1890, members of the two alliances and their allies scored impressive victories in the farm areas. Under the direction of such colorful leaders as Thomas Watson, Mary Elizabeth Lease, who argued that farmers should raise less corn and more hell, William Whiskers Peffer, and sockless Jerry Simpson, the farmers gained control of 7 state legislatures and elected 3 governors, 3 senators, and 52 federal representatives. With the success behind it, the alliance attempted to organize a truly national political force. The People's, or Populist Party, in the presidential election of 1892, they polled over 1 million votes, about 10% of the total. And in the off-year elections of 1894, they increased their vote by an additional 50%. In 1896, however, despite a fusion with the Democrats and a popular and colorful presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, the farmers discovered that they still could not dominate a national election. It was not until the 1930s that they discovered how to bargain with the ever-diminishing political strength and were effectively able to legislate against the costs of economic change. The problems of labor. Labor, too, found itself increasingly dependent upon an impersonal market. And that's a really important topic sentence. Think about that. There was a time when, your labor was your currency, was your wealth, especially in the South. What you could do with your hands, what you could physically do was worth a lot. It was worth enough to grant you a good life. But in the Union, they started introducing and playing with these impersonal markets. And we'll read a little of that Charles Francis writing after this because he talks about that. this whole idea of these invisible entities, these corporations that get treated as if they were people, as if they were a mom and pop store, right? But they're invisible. And this was kind of like something people were apprehensive of course. But as we can see in the Union, it was met with a lot of joy. Okay. So labor, too, found itself increasingly dependent upon an impersonal market. The farmer of the 1820s and 30s had a relatively low income, but no depression or temporary work stoppage would stop him from eating. Again, the worker in the small shop or factory knew the boss and could usually count on being carried over any slack periods. As firms grew, so did the division between the management and the worker. As a result, although earnings were higher, the threat of losing everything through layoff or discharge also increased. In the early years of the Ford Motor Company, for example, everyone on the shop floor knew Henry Ford, and most of them called him Henry. As the firm grew, however, management became more remote, and the company became a classic study in labor management unrest. The workers at Ford and elsewhere attempted to protect themselves from the insecurity of this impersonal relationship. Wow. So, if you think about that impersonal relationship and think about it in the modern time, we are so dependent on the impersonal market that we're pretty much slaves when you think about it. Okay, the union movement. The farmers had attempted to combat impersonal markets through farm organizations. The workers attempted to achieve the same goal through their trade unions. In the 1870s and early 80s, over 100,000 workers joined the Knights of Labor, but this organization was even less effective than the Grange had been. Some temporary successes spurred membership, but leadership proved to be inept. Difficulties also arose because the Knights attempted to merge skilled and unskilled workers into a single union. Nor were the chances of effective labor organization helped by the attitude of the government and the public. In 1894, President Cleveland did not hesitate to employ federal troops to break a railroad strike. Again, the public reacted strongly against labor as a result of police deaths during the Haymarket riots in Chicago. This outcry brought death and long prison sentences to a number of labor leaders whose only crime had been advocating an 8-hour day. Wow, really powerful paragraph. So the author gives two examples of when the federal government used force against striking workers. Long prison sentences, and not only did this happen, but there were police deaths in Chicago at the Haymarket riots. So, you got to think, the overreach of the federal government is already unconstitutional at this point, so they're really asking for it. And I'm sure if we do a little bit of research, we'll find that these police deaths were spun in the Masonic-controlled media to convince people to take the side of the federal government, just like events are used today to do the same thing. Social engineering, right? This is around the time of Nietzsche, nihilism, and Sigmund Freud, right? And really it's the time when witchcraft turned into psychology because that whole Christian half of the country was gone under military occupation. Pretty wild. So between 1886 and 1914, the American Federation of Labor, under the leadership of Samuel Gompers and Adolf Strasser, proved that trade unions with some monopoly power could function in the face of opposition by employers, the government, and the public. The AFL was able to win significant gains without coming into conflict with either the federal government or with a large portion of public opinion. But the same was not true of the unskilled and semi-skilled workers, the slaves. The only union that experienced any success in organizing these classes of laborers was the industrial workers of the world, frequently nicknamed the Wobblies. Despite some success, its members were subjected to continued virulent attack by employers, the public, and the government. At the end of the period, therefore, workers were still attempting to achieve some effective form of protection against the insecurity of the market. However, given strong employer opposition and an unsympathetic public and government, their accomplishments had been small. Wow, that's really sad. So, Civil War ends 1865, and then we have the period of growth where literally slavery, and it's very obvious now with hindsight, the whole idea of slavery, it's so obvious that it was transitioned from physical, evil, grotesque, And then these enlightened thinkers, these Freemasonic thinkers, they shrouded it in a beautiful white cloth, and they just painted it, and they upgraded slavery to a more modern form. And through our readings today, we'll see that. And that slavery consisted of 16-hour work days, your employer owning your house, all sorts of stuff. Horrible, horrible conditions for Americans. If America has a dark age, this would definitely be it for the common person. And this is often called the Gilded Age. And gilded means to, cover something ugly in gold, I believe. And it's perfect because we have, the rise of beautiful architecture and, this aristocracy, which the history books focus on. But for the average people, it was awful. It was an awful series of decades that followed the Civil War and full of change. Okay. The problems of business. Parts of the business community, too, dislike the cost of growth. If an industry's profits rose, it attracted new firms, and the resulting competition lowered prices and frequently squeezed profit margins. In the face of this threat, businessmen also attempted to organize. At first, they quietly colluded to divide the market and maintain a high price. Important sentence there, quietly colluded. These agreements were outside the law, and they could not be legally enforced, since any member could increase his profits more by violating the agreement, as long as no one else did. The pools tended to last only as long as it took someone to break them. In later years, a prominent business leader was asked to testify about the early pools. To the question, quote, "How long did they last?" He answered, quote, "Sometimes a day, sometimes only as long as it took to get to a telephone." Wow. That totally still just happens today. It's happened the whole time. This was the goal of the Civil War, was to create this system. Okay, the trusts. Gradually, however, businessmen became more sophisticated. In the 1880s, they began to use a legal device, the trust, to enforce their agreements. The trust placed legal control of several operating firms in the hands of a single board of directors who had decision-making power. Very important. So we're going to reread that. And it's similar to holding companies, which became popular during this time too. Holding companies basically hold the stocks of two or more companies that are in the same industry but are in competition with each other. Huge consolidations of money, right? So let's read this again. Businessmen became more sophisticated. In the 1880s, they began to use a legal device, the trust, to enforce their agreements. The trust placed legal control of several operating firms in the hands of a single board of directors who had decision-making power. So yeah, this is what Charles Francis Adams warns about in 1868. He's warning about this invisible network of trust and secret agreements and collusion and an impersonal market that everybody's dependent on. He was trying to expose that this is slavery. This is awful. This is going to be, slavery that people have no choice and don't even know is slavery. He knew it was coming. Okay, let's continue. Thus, no individual company could profit by breaking the agreements. Although perhaps continuing to exist as operating units, a number of previously competitive firms were made subject to the decisions of a single monopolistic unit. John D. Rockefeller was among the first to see the benefits, and it was through a trust agreement or arrangement that Standard Oil effected its control over the petroleum industry in the 1880s. Sorry, I logged out on accident. Rockefeller. Success breeds imitation, and other businessmen faced with overzealous competitors were quick to adopt the trust form. Over the next 30 years, important trusts were organized in many sectors of American manufacturing, including such diverse industries as copper, sugar, and whiskey. So we all know what that means. Here's a picture of one of these robber barons. One of these union robber barons. Look at this guy, right? Everybody knows the truth. Look at the table has, looks like books, legislation, has table legs, smoking a cigar. Ridiculous, right? Okay, legislation. Oh, it's a guy bending over. That's what one of the legs is, and it says common people. Public reaction to the trust's behavior produced a wave of anti-monopoly legislation. So just like they dolled up slavery, put some makeup on it, you know what I mean? They're going to doll up the trust system. So here we go. This is great. It produced a wave of anti-monopoly legislation. Since national markets were involved, effective legislation also had to be national. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, but the battle was not yet won. The act had made it illegal to monopolize or collude to monopolize, but it failed to define the term monopoly. However, in one of the earliest cases brought under the new law, United States versus E.C. Knight and Company, 1895, the court ruled that manufacturing did not fall within the definition of interstate commerce. As a result, manufacturing companies were exempt from prosecution. Only gradually was this decision reversed, and it was not until that Standard Oil and American Tobacco cases in 1911 that the courts broke up significant trusts. In the 1911 cases, however, the Supreme Court defined a monopoly as unreasonable monopoly and left to the lower courts the decision of what constituted unreasonableness. In later decisions, the Supreme Court weakened the act by arguing that size or market share alone was not unreasonable, and that unreasonable acts committed in the past were not grounds for prosecution in the future. Thereafter, the nation was given some protection against business monopolies, but the court's rule of reason still hangs like a millstone around the neck of the economy. This was 1961. So, yeah, a little bit confusing, but I mean, do you see anybody attacking Amazon or Monsanto? I mean, we are just dominated by monopolistic corporations. Look at the corporations that control information: Facebook, Twitter, Google, and they're so obviously colluding with one another, and they have a trust with one another openly all the time. All sorts of organizations, and they're all friends. And, you know, despite the legislation of the early 1900s, clearly it doesn't matter. And that's what I mean by putting makeup on these things, right? Slavery, gone. No more. It's off the books. It still exists, though, right? And same with these antitrust laws. They are just pieces of makeup. The corporation still rules. They still monopolize. They still collude. Okay, in 1914, in an attempt to further strengthen anti-monopoly legislation, the Clayton Act was passed. This new act spelled out in some detail particular practices that were to be evidence of monopoly behavior. Once again, however, the Supreme Court weakened the act by leaving the sense of its decisions unclear. As a result, up to World War I, the business community had had considerably more success in protecting itself from the cost of development than had either the farmers or the laborers. So, as you can see, that's where it ends right there. So it didn't turn out all too good for the common people, right? And through our readings today, you're going to see exactly what sort of agenda and plan was really carried out after the Civil War. And this is it, guys. This is the foundation of the UN. This is all of that. Like, this all started right here, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? This is when Rockefeller made his money. This is when oil hit the scene. Electricity became huge, and this is it. So let's look at the origins of it, and let's see what kind of people they were. Because like father, like son. I got a map book here. This is cool. This was my grandfather's. I think we looked at it last time. It's pretty old. Let's see the Civil War one again, and then we'll look at the post-Civil War. So, this bottom one was at the very end of the war, and the orange was Confederate held. And you can see that the rest of it is, you know, Union invading. And, okay, here we go. So, we had the rapid expansion of immigration during this time. And it would peak in, you know, New York, Ellis Island, and everything. It's probably really hard to see, but, you know, little red blips all over the map, all over the country. You know, from California to Maine. Immigrants were brought in everywhere. And you can see here, here's population graphs. Oops. And you can see the expansion there. It's tough to see, my bad. Population exploded. What else we got here? And there's one picture of the land tracts the federal government granted to the to the train industry. It's ridiculous. The specific tracts of land are the width of Massachusetts. They just stretch all across the country. Okay, I can't find it. But what we will do is we'll go ahead and read from the sources of the American Republic, Charles Francis Adams. We're going to read what he had to say. And we did do this last time, but it sets a perfect precedent for what we're going to be looking into. I'll keep it short. So we're reading from Bull, Bear, and Company, The Robber Barons, written by Charles Francis Adams from his book, Erie, 1869. So my bad, it's 1869. Remember, founding father, Samuel Adams, same Adams family, and then John Quincy Adams, founder of the anti-Masonic Republican Party. And in 1869, he's warning us about exactly what these people are going to do. These unionists, these globalists, the Freemason, ecumenical, phony Christian, industrious, enlightened, reasoned North. He says, one leading feature of these developments, however, is, from its political aspect, especially worthy of the attention of the American people. Modern society has created a class of artificial beings who bid fair soon to be the masters of their creator. That's the most important sentence right there. Modern society has created a class of artificial beings. What he's referring to are the corporations, right? This was a new thing. He's referring to the corporations, the agreements, the trust, the impersonal market. The impersonal market is the class of, what words does he use? Artificial beings. Because corporations are treated as people, right? We still pass laws about that today. And he says after that, they bid fair soon to be the masters of their creator. And he's alluding to the fact that these people don't know what they're getting into. It's like Pandora's box. It's the beast system. We literally live in the most Luciferian, satanic beast system today. And we're all starting to learn that right now. And it all really starts with these invisible entities, these corporations. And the Patriot Adams warned us. Let's continue. It is but a very few years since the existence of a corporation controlling a few millions of dollars was regarded as a subject of grave apprehension, and now this country already contains single organizations which wield a power represented by hundreds of millions. So in a span of a few years, those few years being the Civil War, these corporations went from 1 million to hundreds of millions of dollars rapidly. Because war is a racket. That'll probably be the end of this episode. We'll talk about War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. Okay, continuing. Let's see where I was. These bodies are the creatures of single states. But in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Maryland, in New Jersey, and not in those states alone, they are already establishing despotisms, which no spasmodic popular effort will be able to shake off. How eerie is that, you guys? They're establishing despotisms. That is exactly what New York has become, what California has become, what so many places in the country has become. Portland, Maine has become a racist despotism of misinformation. It's awful. They've created despotisms, these, people behind the corporations. And then he says, which no spasmodic popular effort will be able to shake off. So, it's going to be near impossible for us to defeat this. That's what he's saying. He's like, you're all going to wake up one day and that's not going to be enough to destroy this. It's essentially what Mr. Adams is saying right there, which is, doesn't sound very good. And that's what we're living through today. And let's continue. Then we'll move on. Okay. Corporations have no souls. Only in New York has any intimation yet been given of what the future may have in store for us should these great powers become mere tools in the hands of ambitious, reckless men. The system of corporate life and corporate power, as applied to industrial development, is yet in its infancy. It tends always towards development, always to consolidation. It is ever grasping new powers or insidiously exercising covert influence. Even now, the system threatens the central government. There's the warning. He says, even now, this system of invisible things, these corporations, massive corporations, that all they do is exponentially want more and grow and consolidate, and they have no souls. Those are threatening the central government, and then in 1871, just 2 years later, they pass the incorporation of Washington, D.C. as a body corporate. And, that's really what sealed the deal. Fascinating, right? Okay. Next, we're going to read from this awesome book, which I didn't even know I had. I wish I knew I had it, because I could have used it in all the episodes. It's called Documents of American History, Coinage, 6th edition. Let me open up the copyright page, because I don't even know. Okay, Appleton Century Crofts Incorporated, New York. Copyright 1958. Nice. This is going to be a good one. I went through, I bookmarked a bunch of important events. This book has everything from inaugural addresses to, congressional arguments to labor union speeches, all sorts of important historical documents. Okay, so we're going to begin reading out of Documents of American History. This is going to be a great one. And we're going to begin with Jefferson Davis's message to Congress, April 29th, 1861. So there's a little intro I'll read first. Davis called the Confederate Congress together in special session April 29th, 1861. In his message, he analyzed again the theory of the Union and the logic of secession. In this message, he also asked for authority to prosecute the war. In response to his request, Congress at this session authorized him to use all the land and naval force of the Confederacy, to issue letters of marque, raise volunteers, make loans, etc. So, here we're going to get the point of view of the President of the Confederacy. Okay. Gentlemen of the Congress, the declaration of war made against this Confederacy by Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, in his proclamation issued on the 15th day of the present month, rendered it necessary, in my judgment, that you should convene at the earliest practicable moment, to devise the measures necessary for the defense of the country. The occasion is indeed an extraordinary one. It justifies me in a brief review of the relations heretofore existing between us and the states, which now unite in warfare against us, and in such a statement of the events which have resulted in this warfare, to the end that mankind may pass intelligent and impartial judgment on its motives and objects. During the war waged against Great Britain by her colonies on this continent, a common danger impelled them to a close alliance into the formation of a confederation, by the terms of which the colonies, styling themselves states, entered, quote, severally into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to, or attacks made upon them, or any of them, on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense whatever, end quote. In order to guard against any misconstruction of their compact, the several states made explicit declaration in a distinct article that, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled, end quote. Under this contract of alliance, the War of the Revolution was successfully waged and resulted in the Treaty of Peace with Great Britain in 1783, by the terms of which the several states were, each by name, recognized to be independent. The Articles of Confederation contained a clause whereby all alterations were prohibited unless confirmed by the legislatures of every state after being agreed to by the Congress. And in obedience to this provision, under the resolution of Congress of the 21st of February, 1787, the several states appointed delegates who attended a convention, quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union," end quote. And Davis put emphasis on confirmed by the states. It was by the delegates chosen by the several states under the resolution just quoted that the Constitution of the United States was framed in 1787 and submitted to the several states for ratification, as shown by the 7th article, which is in these words, quote, "The ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states, so ratifying the same," end quote. The Constitution of 1787 having, however, omitted the clause already recited from the Articles of Confederation, which provided in explicit terms that each state retained its sovereignty and independence. Some alarm was felt in the states when invited to ratify the Constitution, lest this omission should be construed into an abandonment of their cherished principle, and they refused to be satisfied until amendments were added to the Constitution, placing beyond any pretense of doubt the reservation by the states of all their sovereign rights and powers not expressly delegated to United States by the Constitution. Basically what he's saying is when they tried to leave that out, when they switched from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the colonies, this, newly formed states at the time, were not having it. And they said, "Forever and always shall the states maintain their sovereign independence." Let me continue here. "Strange indeed must it appear to the impartial observer, but it is none the less true, that all these carefully worded clauses proved unavailing to prevent the rising growth in the northern states of a political school which has persistently claimed that the government thus formed was not a compact between the states, but was in effect a national government, set up above and over the states. An organization created by the states to secure the blessings of liberty and independence against foreign aggression has been gradually perverted into a machine for their control in the domestic affairs. The creature has been exalted above its creators." Wow, we have to pause there and remember the words of Charles Francis Adam, who said exactly that. Maybe he got that from Davis here. Let me continue. The creature has been exalted over its creators. The principles have been made subordinate to the agent, appointed by themselves. The people of the southern states, whose almost exclusive occupation was agriculture, early perceived a tendency in the northern states to render the common government subservient to their own purposes by imposing burdens on commerce as a protection to their manufacturing and shipping interest. By degrees, as the northern states gained preponderance in the National Congress, self-interest taught their people to yield ready assent to any plausible advocacy of their right as a majority to govern the minority without control. They learned to listen with impatience to the suggestion of any constitutional impediment to the exercise of their will, and so utterly have the principles of the Constitution been corrupted in the northern mind that, in the inaugural address delivered by President Lincoln in March last, he asserts as an axiom, which he plainly deems to be undeniable, that the theory of the Constitution requires that in all cases the majority shall govern. ... Sounds like he paused here. And you guys know, as my viewers, that we are not a democracy. Democracy was dangerous, according to Plato, and the ancient Greeks were a republic, right? This is the lamentable and fundamental error on which rests the policy that has culminated in his declaration of war against these Confederate states. In addition to the long-continued and deep-seated resentment felt by the Southern states at the persistent abuse of the powers they had delegated to the Congress for the purpose of enriching the manufacturing and shipping classes of the North at the expense of the South, there has existed for nearly half a century another subject of discord involving interest of such transcendent magnitude as at all times to create the apprehension in the minds of many devoted lovers of the Union that its permanence was impossible. When the several states delegated certain powers to the United States Congress, a large portion of the laboring population consisted of African slaves imported into the colonies by the mother country. This is going to be important. In 12 out of the 13 states, Negro slavery existed, and the right of property in slaves was protected by law. This property was recognized in the Constitution, and provision was made against this loss by the escape of the slave. The increase in the number of slaves by further importation from Africa was also secured by a clause forbidding Congress to prohibit the slave trade anterior to a certain date, and in no clause can there be found any delegation of power to the Congress authorizing it in any manner to legislate to the prejudice, detriment, or discouragement of the owners of that species of property, or excluding it from the protection of the government. The climate and soil of the northern states soon proved unpropitious to the continuance of slave labor, whilst the converse was the case at the south. Under the unrestricted free intercourse between the two sections, the northern states consulted their own interest by selling their slaves to the south and prohibiting slavery within their limits. The South were willing purchasers of property, suitable to their wants, and paid the price of the acquisition without harboring a suspicion that their quiet possession was to be disturbed by those who were inhibited, not only by want of constitutional authority, but by good faith as vendors, from disquieting a title emanating from themselves. As soon, however, as the northern states that prohibited African slavery within their limits had reached a number sufficient to give their representation a controlling voice in the Congress, a persistent and organized system of hostile measures against the rights of the owners of slaves in the southern states was inaugurated and gradually extended. A continuous series of measures was devised and prosecuted for the purpose of rendering insecure the tenure of property in slaves. Emboldened by success, the theater of agitation and aggression against the clearly expressed constitutional rights of the southern states was transferred to the Congress. Senators and representatives were sent to the common councils of the nation, whose chief title to this distinction consisted in the display of a spirit of ultra-fanaticism, and whose business was not to promote the general welfare or ensure domestic tranquility, but to awaken the bitterest hatred against the citizens of sister states by violent denunciation of their institutions. Wow. Sound familiar? Now, what he's describing is exactly what they're doing today with the left-right paradigm. He's saying Congress created these groups of people who were ultra-fanatic and whose business was not to promote the general welfare or ensure domestic tranquility, but to awaken the bitterest hatred against the citizens of sister states. I mean, you compare 2019 to 2020 when you want to talk about race relations, and yeah, it began under Obama. Well, it began with a war in the Middle East, really, but they ramp it up by their own will, and people just eat it up and buy it. It's crazy. Let's continue. The transactions of public affairs was impeded by repeated efforts to usurp powers, not delegated by the Constitution, for the purpose of impairing the security of property in slaves, and reducing those states which held slaves to a condition of inferiority. Finally, a great party was organized for the purpose of obtaining the administration of the government, with the avowed object of using its power for the total exclusion of the slave states from all participation in the benefits of the public domain acquired by all the states in common, whether by conquest or purchase, of surrounding them entirely by states in which slavery should be prohibited, of those rendering the property in slaves so insecure as to be comparatively worthless, and thereby annihilating, in effect, property worth thousands of millions of dollars. This party, thus organized, succeeded in the month of November last year in the election of its candidate for the presidency of the United States. In the meantime, the African slaves had augmented in number from about 600,000 at the date of the adoption of the Constitution to upward of 4 million in moral and social condition. They had been Okay, listen, this is probably important. Hold on. Let me start over. In the meantime, the African slaves had augmented in number from about 600,000 at the date of the adoption of the Constitutional Compact to upward of 4 million. In moral and social condition, they had been elevated from brutal savages into docile, intelligent, and civilized agricultural laborers, and supplied not only with bodily comforts, but with careful religious instruction. Under the supervision of a superior race, their labor had been so directed as not only to allow a gradual and marked amelioration of their own condition, but to convert hundreds of thousands of square miles of the wilderness into cultivated lands, covered with a prosperous people. Towns and cities had sprung into existence and had rapidly increased in wealth and population under the social system of the South. The white population of the southern slaveholding states had augmented from about 1.25 million at the date of the adoption of the Constitution to more than 8.5 million in 1860, and the productions in the South of cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco, for the full development and continuance of which the labor of African slaves is indispensable, had swollen to an amount which formed nearly 3/4 of the exports of the whole United States, and had become absolutely necessary to the wants of civilized man. With interest of such overwhelming magnitude imperiled, the people of the southern states were driven by the conduct of the North to the adoption of some course of action to avert the danger with which they were openly menaced. With this view, the legislatures of the several states invited the people to select delegates to conventions, to be held for the purpose of determining for themselves what measures were best adapted to meet so alarming a crisis in their history. Here it may be proper to observe that from a period as early as 1798, there had existed in all of the states of the Union a party almost uninterruptedly in the majority, based upon the creed that each state was, in the last resort, the sole judge as well of its wrongs as of the mode and measure of redress. In the exercise of a right so ancient, so well established, and so necessary for self-preservation, the people of the Confederate States in their conventions determined that the wrongs with which they had suffered and the evils with which they were menaced required that they should revoke the delegation of powers to the federal government, from the federal government. Sorry, I hit a button, just making sure it was still recording. Okay, they consequently passed ordinances resuming all their rights as sovereign and independent states and dissolved their connection with the other states of the Union. Having done this, they proceeded to form a new compact amongst themselves by new articles of confederation, which have been also ratified by the conventions of the several states with an approach to unanimity, far exceeding that of the conventions which adopted the Constitution of 1787. They have organized their new government in all its departments. The functions of the executive, legislative, and judicial magistrates are performed in accordance with the will of the people, as displayed not merely in a cheerful acquiescence, but in the enthusiastic support of the government thus established by themselves, but for the interference of the government of the United States in this legitimate exercise of the right of a people to self-government, peace, happiness, prosperity, and now smile on our land. Peace, happiness, and prosperity would now smile on our land. So that's a great explanation of the Confederate point of view. And obviously, I denounce all forms of slavery, but it's quite clear that the North usurped the Constitution over and over and over and over again, to the point of conquering the South. Because it's an absolute fact, and it was agreed by all of our founding fathers that these states shall remain sovereign forever and always, no matter what. Whatever number of states you have at a time should all be sovereign and willingly volunteering in the confederation that is the federal government of the United States. But it appears here that that didn't happen back then. It's not happening today, obviously, but certainly didn't happen back then. And they forced the South into war and conquered them. And then a few years later, passed the act incorporating the District of Columbia as a corporation. Wow. Yeah, this book's great. I'm going to flip through some of my bookmarks, and we'll see what we got here. So I mentioned this before. That last reading was from 1861. Now we're going to after the war, 1866. And this is Efforts to Encourage Immigration, South Carolina Statutes at Large, Volume 13, page 380. Remember, it was the North's plan to cause chaos, to free the slaves, to try to get immigration to the North so that they could fill their new system, the system of factory and manufacturing, all that stuff. Basically the system we're kind of living in today. They needed people from the South to fill all those positions because their corporations were growing so quickly, right? They needed more, always more. That's exactly what Charles Francis Adams said. Corporations always require more, and they certainly needed more labor. So 1866, here's the intro from the author of this. The demand for industrial labor, the opening up of the West, and the disorganization of the labor system of the South all led to official as well as unofficial efforts to encourage immigration. Most southern states attempted to attract immigrants to take the place of the Negro worker, but uniformly without success. In South Carolina, a state commissioner of agriculture was created, and a pamphlet advertising the attractions of the state, published in several languages and distributed widely throughout northern Europe. Wow, that's what this is. I assumed it was for immigration to the north, but here we have a pamphlet trying to convince Europeans to come work in the South. 1. Be it enacted, here's a legislation that created the pamphlet. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives, now met and sitting in General Assembly, and by the authority of the same, that for the purpose of encouraging, promoting, and protecting European immigration in this state, the sum of $10,000 be appropriated from the contingent fund to be expended under the direction of the government for the purposes and in the manner hereinafter provided. That's pretty funny. But we don't have to read that. What else we got here? So, in 1868, the Ku Klux Klan came out. You think that's a coinky-dink? You think they were, I have a feeling it was a northern influenced group that probably created the Ku Klux Klan. So let's read about that. Organization and Principles, 1868, page 154 of one of their documents. Okay. They do have an intro, so let's read it. The Ku Klux Klan, one of the two largest of the secret organizations that flourished in the South during Reconstruction, was founded in 1865 at Pulaski, Tennessee. The order grew rapidly in 1867 and 1868. A general organization was perfected in May 1867, at which a constitution was adopted. General Bedford Forrest was the first Grand Wizard of the order. The order was effective in frightening the Negro out of his unnatural alliance with the Union leagues, but it was used as a cloak for lawlessness and violence and formally disbanded in 1869. Its activities continued, however, for some time after this date. Congress took cognizance of the order and similar secret societies such as the Knights of the White Camellia by passing the Ku Klux Klan Acts of May 31st, 1870 and April 20th, 1871. Wow. A congressional KKK committee sat during the summer of 1871 and took 13 volumes of testimony on conditions in the South, etc. That's exactly what they're doing today with 17 Anon, right? So it seems. So it definitely seems. They likely created this and then they use it against the people with false flags, and they use it as a means to censor and to shut down free speech. So we don't have to read that. We know all about that, really. We get so much KKK propaganda from the mainstream media. Okay, this one's really interesting. So this was in 1871, May 8th, and I can't remember the exact date, January, February, March, April, May. This might have been right after the Act of 1871 was passed. So this was from May 8th, 1871. It's called the Treaty of Washington. This is going to blow your mind. Here's the intro from the author. The failure of the Johnson-Clarendon Convention of 1869 left Anglo-American relations in an unsatisfactory state. The Treaty of Washington provided for the arbitration of the most pressing problem of our relations with Great Britain, the Alabama claims. The treaty represented a triumph of the ideas of Secretary of State Fish over those of Charles Sumner on the Treaty of Washington. Okay. Wait till you hear this. Okay. Treaty relative to claims, fisheries, navigation of the St. Lawrence, etc. American lumber on the River St. John boundary. Talking about river in Alabama. Okay. Article 1. Whereas differences have arisen between the government of the United States and the government of Her Britannic Majesty, and still exist, growing out of the acts committed by the several vessels which have given rise to the claims generically known as the Alabama claims. And whereas Her Britannic Majesty has authorized her high commissioners and plenipotentiaries to express in a friendly spirit the regret felt by Her Majesty's government for the escape under whatever circumstances of the Alabama and other vessels from British ports, and for the depredations committed by those vessels. Now, in order to remove and adjust all complaints and claims on the part of the United States, and to provide for the speedy settlement of such claims which are not admitted by Her Britannic Majesty's government, the high contracting parties agree that all said claims growing out of acts committed by the aforesaid vessels, and generically known as Alabama claims, shall be referred to a Tribunal of Arbitration, to be composed of 5 arbitrators, to be appointed in the following manner, that is to say, 1. Shall be named by the President of the United States. 1 shall be named by Her Britannic Majesty. 1 shall be named by His Majesty of the King of Italy. And the President of the Swiss Confederation shall be requested to name one, and His Majesty the Emperor of Brazil shall be requested to name one. What are they talking about? So they're talking about some crime committed in an Alabama port. Maybe someone stole vessels. Maybe this was related to back in the Civil War, but it sounds like the most pressing problem of our relations with Great Britain was the Alabama claims. So this must have something to do with trade with Britain. And you can see here, only 6 years after the Civil War, they had incorporated Washington, D.C., and now they are creating arbitration panels made up of Britain's Majesty, the Majesty and the King of Italy, the President of the Swiss Confederation. We all know why that's in there, for banking, right? And the Majesty Emperor of Brazil. So you can already tell. Globalization. Right away. Right off the bat. Interesting. Let's see what it says. Got some more here. A neutral government is bound, first, to use due diligence to prevent the fitting out, arming, or equipping within its jurisdiction of any vessel which it has reasonable ground to believe is intended to cruise or to carry on war against any power with which it is at peace, and also to use like diligence to prevent the departure from its jurisdiction of any vessel intended to cruise or carry on war as above, such vessel having been specially adapted in whole or in part within such jurisdiction to warlike use. Ooh, maybe this was a post-Civil War uprising, or maybe this took place during the Civil War, but we're talking about armed boats. Secondly, not to permit or suffer either belligerent or make use of its ports or waters as the base of naval operations against the other, or for the purpose of renewal or augmentation of military supplies or arms, or the recruitment of men. Thirdly, to exercise due diligence in its own ports and waters, and as to all persons within its jurisdiction, to prevent any violation of the foregoing obligations and duties. Her Britannic Majesty has commanded her High Commissioners and plenipotentiaries to declare that Her Majesty's government cannot assent to the foregoing rules as a statement of principles of international law which were in force at the time when the claims mentioned in Article 1 arose, but that Her Majesty's government, in order to evince its desire of strengthening the friendly relations between the two countries and of making satisfactory provision for the future, agrees that in deciding the questions between the two countries arising out of those claims, the arbitrators should assume that Her Majesty's government had undertaken to act upon the principles set forth in these rules. And the high contracting parties agree to observe these rules as between themselves in future, and to bring them to the knowledge of other maritime powers, and to invite them to accede as well. Wow. So just calling on nations to come together. And it's funny how they mention the Swiss for banking. We have, Her Majesty, England, the City of London, which was, like the financial portion of this world government. And then you have the King of Italy, of course, the Vatican, which is the spiritual aspect of this global government. So yeah, you have the Swiss with the capital, the English with the financial know-how, the Italians with the spiritual aspect, and of course America, whose destiny, as we know from the Rose Cross Order, was to be the basically world police aspect of this new world order. And you can see right after the Civil War, here we go. We're setting up a panel of these five countries, right? These 5 groups, and they are the arbitrators that will oversee disputes throughout the world. And yeah, a very different America arose after the Civil War. It's quite incredible. They don't teach us anything about it. Okay, next we're going to talk about the crime of 73. So remember, this is really the age of the corporation coming to power, and of course, banking and the economy have a lot to do with that as well. They didn't implement like the fiat currency system right away because, like I've mentioned, there were still factions within the northern political scene, and not everybody was looking forward to currency not backed by anything. So we're going to read the crime of 73. That's how it was known. It's called the Coinage Act of February 12th, 1873, from the United States Statutes at Large, Volume 17, page 424. And the author here is an intro. This act revising the coinage system of the country omitted from the coinage the standard silver dollar of 412.5 grains. This demonetization of silver came later to be known as the crime of 73. So, that pretty much sums it up for his intro right there. But yeah, in 1873, they passed an act revising the coinage system and removing the the silver dollar from circulation. Yes, there was a time when actual 412.5 grain silver dollars were circulated. And let's read this a little bit. Okay, it's called an act revising and amending the laws relative to the mints, assay offices, and coinage of the United States. Once again, right after the Civil War. Section 14, that the gold coins of the United States shall be a $1 piece, which at the standard weight of 25 8/10 grains shall be the unit of value, a quarter eagle or $2.50 piece, a $3 piece, a half eagle or $5 piece, an eagle or $10 piece, and a double eagle or $20 piece. That's right, the double eagle. Straight up masonry. Which coins shall be a legal tender in all payments at their nominal value, when not below the standard weight and limit of tolerance provided in this act for the single piece, and, when reduced in weight below said standard and tolerance, shall be a legal tender at valuation in proportion to their actual weight. So that's how it worked. Just by the weight, gold. Section 15, that the silver coins of the United States shall be a trade dollar, a half-dollar or 50-cent piece, a quarter-dollar or 25-cent piece, a dime or 10-cent piece, and said coins shall be a legal tender at their nominal value for any amount not exceeding $5 in any one payment. Section 16, that the minor coins of the United States shall be a 5-cent piece, a 3-cent piece, and a 1-cent piece, which coins shall be a legal tender at their nominal value for any amount not exceeding 25 cents in any one payment. Section 17, that no coins either of gold, silver, or minor coinage shall hereafter be issued from the mint other than those of the denomination standards and weights set forth. So maybe this was this is the act revising it. So they had to go ahead and you can tell that they were in dispute with one another. Let's see what we got here. So this is important. It's called the Granger Movement. This was mentioned earlier. So in that first reading we did. The two documents below illustrate the local and the general character of the Granger Movement. The first indicates the anti-railroad character of the movement in the Middle Western states. The second emphasizes the social rather than the economic character of the movement. Okay. Let's see here. Which one do we want to read? Let's read the first one. All right. So, Resolution of Springfield, Illinois Farmers Convention, April 2nd, 1873. And in the beginning, that first book we read, they mentioned the ploy of the farmer during these decades after the Civil War up to World War I and the struggle that the farmer went through in this country. And the truly subsistent farmer that was living on their own without relying on the government at all was destroyed during this time. So they formed groups, farmers' conventions, unions. They tried to team up with manufacturing unions. They tried to do everything they could to fight the federal government, but in the end, they weren't able to keep much ground. That's basically what that book said. All right, so let's hear the character of this. 1. Resolved by the farmers of Illinois in mass, meeting assembled, that all charter monopolies not regulated or controlled by law have proved detrimental to the public prosperity, corrupting in their management and dangerous to Republican institutions. Very powerful paragraph, right? So that these charter monopolies are not regulated or controlled by law. And they're saying it's detrimental to public prosperity, corrupts management, and dangerous to Republican institutions. That sounds like a death warrant, right? Most certainly is. Number 2, resolved that the railways of the world, except in those countries where they have been held under the strict regulation and supervision of the government, have proved themselves arbitrary, extortionate, and as opposed to free institutions and free commerce between states as were the feudal barons of the Middle Ages. We understand that second part, right? These people are barons. It's exactly what they are. 3, resolved that we hold, declare, and resolve that this despotism, which defies our laws, plunders our shippers, impoverishes our people, and corrupts our government, shall be subdued and made to subvert the public interest at whatever cost. Resolved that in view of the present extortions, we look with alarm upon the future of an interest which can combine in the hands of a few men a capital of nearly 250 million, and we believe it essential to the prosperity of all classes that this contest continue until these corporations acknowledge the supremacy of law. This is pretty incredible what we're reading. So I'd imagine 1873, this is only 2 years after the corporation is created. It must have taken some time for it to subtly trickle down through the secret societies, brotherhoods, and fraternities to the average businessman that, this is the way it is now. We don't have a say. We can't just stand up and try to legislate against these corporations. And that's exactly what these people are trying to do. And it's sad because it was a very tough war, a war that was fought after the Civil War, a war fought by these farmers. And let's keep reading. Number 6, resolved that we regard it as the undoubted power and the imperative duty of the legislature to pass laws fixing reasonable maximum rates for freight and passengers without classification of roads, and that we urge upon our General Assembly the passage of such laws. Resolved that we urge the passage of a bill enforcing the principle that railroads are public highways and requiring railroads to make connections with all roads whose tracks meet or cross their own, and to receive and transmit cars and trains offered over their roads at reasonable maximum rates, whether offered at such crossings or at stations along their roads, and empowering the making of connections by municipal corporations for that purpose and for public use. Resolved, number 12, that we endorse most fully the actions of those who tender legal rates of fare upon the railroads and refuse to pay more, and that it is the duty of the legislature to provide by law for the defense by the state of Illinois of suits commenced or that hereafter may be commenced by railroad companies against individuals who have in good faith insisted or hereafter may insist upon the right to ride in railroads at legal rates. We'll stop there because they keep going. They go a lot, and it just shows the nature of the way that the Union just allowed a small group of people, basically their friends, to monopolize all of these industries and completely shape the future of the country, and then to have the nerve to write it all out of history, pretty much, or just not teach it in the public school system. It's so sick, and it's so evil, but that's a theme of this episode, is this fight. It's rough. Let's read this one. Commonwealth versus Hamilton Manufacturing Company. How appropriate. 1876. Massachusetts was the pioneer state in labor legislation designed to protect women and children from undue exploitation. This case involved the constitutionality of a statute limiting the hours of labor of minors and women in manufacturing establishments to 60 a week. How many people today, especially my generation, have ever worked 60 hours a week? And they're passing bills to limit it to 60 hours a week. So that means these people are working more than 60 hours a week. Children and women. So this is exactly the slavery that happened after the Civil War. This is the enlightened slavery that the Union wanted to make happen and did make happen. Disgusting. Let's read this. Lord J., the defendant, contends that the statute of 1874, section 221, under which the complaint in this case is made, is unconstitutional and void. The provision, which it is alleged is without authority under the Constitution, it is that, quote, no minor under the age of 18 years and no woman over that age shall be employed in laboring by any person, firm, or corporation in any manufacturing establishment in this Commonwealth more than 10 hours in any one day. End quote. except in certain cases, in that, quote, in no case shall the hours of labor exceed 60 per week, end quote. The learned counsel for the defendant in his argument did not refer to any particular clause of the Constitution to which this provision is repugnant. His general proposition was that the defendant's act of incorporation is a contract with the Commonwealth, and that this act impairs that contract. The contract, it is claimed, is an implied one, that is, an act of incorporation to manufacture cotton and woolen goods by necessary implication confers upon the corporation the legal capacity to contract for all the labor needful for this work. If this is conceded to the fullest extent, it is only a contract with the corporation that it may contract for all lawful labor. There is no contract implied that such labor as was then forbidden by law might be employed by the defendant, or that the general court would not perform its constitutional duty of making such wholesome laws thereafter as the public welfare should demand. The law therefore violates no contract with the defendant, and the only other question is whether it is in violation of any right reserved under the Constitution to the individual citizen. Upon this question, there seems to be no room for debate. It does not forbid any person, firm, or corporation from employing as many persons or as much labor as such person, firm, or corporation may desire, nor does it forbid any person to work as many hours a day or a week as he chooses. So you can see here just the complete disregard for human welfare in Massachusetts in 1876. You know, a lawyer gets in there and argues that, hey, if a woman or a child want to work 80 hours a week, they should be allowed to work 80 hours a week. But of course, the reality is that most of these people lived in housing that was owned by the factory owner. You know, they were completely dependent on what was called the impersonal market that we learned about in the other reading, right? That's awful. Let's see what else we got here. There's an encyclical, but we're not going to read that. St. Louis, Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific Railroad Company. Okay, that's probably important, but we're going to skip it because we have another book we got to get to. So here we have 1887, fast forward 10 years. We have the Interstate Commerce Act, and this is going to be important. Here's the author's little background. The exclusive character of federal regulation of interstate commerce had been established as early as 1824, yet it was not until over a half a century later that Congress passed any law looking to national regulation of commerce. There you go, national regulation of commerce. So for the first half of our country's history, like, the states were actually sovereign with their own currencies and their own taxes and their own rules and charges on things. And, you know, it's just completely different than what we have today. Today, the federal government is so overreaching and so powerful, we can't even imagine what it would be like to have sovereign states with different currencies, right? And that's been the work of, you know, the Union, the Freemasons, the ecumenical people, the same people we always talk about. And they've done quite the job pulling this off. So, let's read this. An act to regulate commerce. I mean, I think you guys probably already know, but for example, you know, Carnegie or whoever sets up a railroad going through 3 states, right? Those states should be allowed to set their own taxes and their own rates and their own little fees here and there for all sorts of stuff, right? For the utilities that the railroad company is using in their state. But it didn't always go that way, and eventually it just became federalized, and that's what we're going to read about now. So now the federal government, who are all open friends with the robber barons, are going to set those rates. They're not going to let the states regulate their own commerce, and we still live with that today. So, an act to regulate commerce be it enacted, that the provisions of this act shall apply to any common carrier or carriers engaged in the transportation of passengers or property wholly by railroad or partly by railroad and partly by water, when both are used under a common control, management, or arrangement for a continuous carriage or shipment from one state or territory of the U.S. or the District of Columbia to any other state or territory of the United States or the District of Columbia. Wow, guys. 1887. This is the oldest document I've ever read, except for the Act of 1871, that differentiates the United States from the District of Columbia. Wow, that's crazy. I'm going to read it again. From one state or territory of the United States or the District of Columbia to any other state or territory of the United States or the District of Columbia. Wow. Damn. And also to the transportation in like manner of property shipped from any place in the United States to a foreign country and carried from such place to a port of transshipment, or shipped from a foreign country to any place in the United States. So literally, guys, all commerce will be regulated by the federal government. And there was no one there to combat this, because remember, we went from a house divided to half of the house being defeated at war, basically, right? So now the House, although the South is technically representing themselves, they have just been under military control for quite some time. And yeah, we know the Union influenced politics in the South like they still do to this day. The same think tank group of people, that Northeast enlightened group of people. Okay, the term railroad, as used in this act, shall include all bridges and ferries used. It's literally everything. Wow. All charges made for any service rendered or to be rendered in the transportation of passengers or property as aforesaid or in connection therewith, or for the receiving, delivering, storage, or handling of such property shall be reasonable and just, and every unjust and reasonable charge for such service is... You know what, guys? This is when they started writing laws with absolutely ridiculous language, because before the Civil War, it wasn't this impossible to read any legislation. And trying to read this, it's literally a form of witchcraft. It's insane. But there you go. 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act. The government, the federal government, said no more. No more disputes. No more arguments. We're going to be in charge. And guess who we're going to side with? The corporations. It was time to become a global power, pretty much, right? So we're in the 1880s right now, 1890s. That's when this picture's from on your screen. The infrastructure was in place. The enemy of the Union was subdued. Their enemies were no more. They had created these corporations, which we know were new back then and very dangerous, and they were ready to fulfill their role in the secret societies, fulfill their role in the synagogue of Satan, to be the enforcer, to be the world police, to spread their influence across all of this plane, and to influence the world towards the beast system. That is exactly what happened. Exactly what happened. Every little boy in every third world country dreams of coming to America. Everybody everywhere dreams of coming to America. They are infatuated by how open we are with our sexuality and our rock and roll and our drugs and our so-called freedoms. But it's all really a sinister, sinister plot carried out by this synagogue of Satan. And we are fulfilling our role. All right, so what we have here is a judicial review of railroad rates, and this is going to be important. So the background is, beginning with the Granger laws of the late 60s and early 70s, many Midwestern and Southern states established railway commissions with the power of fixing railway charges. So that's good background for what we were just saying. The Interstate Commerce Act obviously would have overridden all of this. So before the Interstate Commerce Act, like in 1876, the states had the power to regulate charges and established fixed rates. Okay. But who was to decide whether a rate was reasonable, and what was it to be the basis upon which these charges were to be predicated? These and related questions have plagued the courts for the last half century, and no satisfactory solution has yet been discovered. So that's kind of your reasoning for the Interstate Commerce Act, because there was just war everywhere. War in the courts. Okay. And this is very important. The Sherman Antitrust Act. This microphone stand sucks. Okay, U.S. Statute at Large, Volume 26, page 209. I'm sure you have all heard of the Sherman Antitrust Act, but let's read it. Because the growth of trust in corporations and some of the more notorious malpractices of big business led to a growing demand for the regulation of trusts by the federal government. Both parties demanded such regulation in their platforms of 1888. December 4th, 1889, Senator Sherman introduced a bill providing for the regulation of trusts. A trust is when a bunch of different interests get together and create a board of directors to oversee it. So it can be a bunch of different corporations, different legal entities.
All right, let's continue. The final bill, which bears Sherman's name, was written chiefly by Senators Hoar and Edmunds, the first federal act ever passed which attempted to regulate trusts. It was couched in general and often ambiguous language. The bill contains no definition of a trust or of a monopoly, and no indication of the meaning of the term restraint. Nor was it clear at the time of the passage of the act whether its terms were meant to embrace combinations of labor as well as of capital. These and similar questions were deliberately left to the courts. The literature on the Sherman Act is extensive. Wow. So you can tell by this short intro that, it seems like definitions, which are very important in legal, writing legal acts, definitions are left out on purpose. They deliberately leave that language out so that it goes down to the courts. And, you have a problem like you had before the Interstate Commerce Act, where the courts are always tied up with this issue over and over. And that's really the effect of the Sherman Antitrust Act. See, when I learned about the Sherman Antitrust Act as a kid, they said it was great, fixed everything. Teddy Roosevelt came in afterwards, everything was fine. It was great. 6-hour work days. Yep. No worry. Yeah, but we're going to read this, and it's going to probably say something a little different. Okay, so let's read an act to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraints and monopolies. Be it enacted. Clearly this didn't work. Okay, 1. Every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is hereby declared to be illegal. Every person who shall make any such contract or engage in any such combination of or conspiracy shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and on conviction thereof shall be punished by fine not exceeding $5,000 or by imprisonment not exceeding 1 year, or by both, said punishments in the discretion of the court. Section 2. Every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states or with foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a misdemeanor, and on conviction thereof shall be punished by fine not exceeding $5,000. Wow. Well, clearly didn't work, because friends in high places. Let's see what else we got in this text before we move on. Quite a few things. Once again, great book. Let's see. Okay, let's check this out. 1895. This will be the last one out of this text, and then we'll move on. Appeal from the United States Circuit Court, United States versus E.C. Knight Company. Okay, so this was an appeal from the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, bill by the United States against the E.C. Knight Company and other corporations charging violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The E.C. Knight Company, the American Sugar Refining Company, had purchased the stock of 4 competing sugar refining companies located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and thus secured a practical monopoly on the manufacture of refined sugar in the United States. It was charged that these purchases constituted a combination and restraint of trade. The Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed the bill. Wow. Of course they did. See, this is how they do it. They manipulate the public into demanding something like the Antitrust Act, right? And then they write the bill in such a way that they can use it to pick and choose who to use it against. And then they only use it against the people who called for it. They don't use it against their friends, right? That is exactly how this dark magic works. Let me say that again. They convince the public that they need to pass certain legislation, in this case, Antitrust Act. They are in charge of writing the legislation, so they write it in a way where they can use it primarily against the people who asked for it, not against the people that are committing the crimes, right? Doesn't it always seem that way, that the laws are for us and not for them? I mean, it couldn't be any more obvious today. So let's see, let's read this. They dismissed the case. Okay, in the view which we take of the case, we need not discuss whether because the tentacles which drew the outlying refineries into the dominant corporation were separately put out, therefore there was no combination to monopolize, or because according to political economists, aggregations of capital may reduce prices, therefore the objection to concentration of power is relieved, or because others were theoretically left free to go into the business of refining sugar, and the original stockholders of the Philadelphia refineries, after becoming stockholders of the American company, might go into competition with themselves, or parting with the stock might set up again for themselves. Therefore, no objectionable restraint was imposed. Simple as that. So a wonderful example of the people demanding legislation only to have that very legislation used against them while the rich stay rich and protected. So yeah, I'm just going through my bookmarks here. Okay, let's move on to the next one. The next one's a bit different. It's more of opinion pieces. It's written in a more exciting manner. Get that out of the way. Okay, so we already read. Let's read from an author called Henry Demarest Lloyd, Wealth Against Commonwealth. This is from 1894, so times up perfectly with where we're at. It's from the sources of the American Republic, which is from 1970-something. All right, so we have a little bit of an intro by the author of this textbook. It says, "The Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century was a cause of wonder and alarm to Americans. The emerging technology and business organization of the industrial era seemed to generate miraculous powers for creating goods and services out of the natural riches of the continent. Yet, in the midst of economic progress, a strange new world confronted the American people. Whole industries were dominated by one or a few giant corporations, whose resources exceeded those of many states. The consolidation of a large part of the nation's railroads into half a dozen major systems subjected the commerce of the nation to the will of the masters of capital. The corporation and the supercorporation, the trust and the holding company, increasingly displaced the traditional figure of the responsible owner-manager of business enterprises. Wall Street, the mysterious haunt of bulls and bears, decided fundamental policies for the national economy. Broadly, the mastery of the nation seemed to pass from the people and their political leaders to the imperious captains of industry and finance. Liberty produces wealth, wrote the social critic Henry Demarest Lloyd, and wealth destroys liberty. One bignesses, cities, factories, monopolies, fortunes, which are our empires, are the obesities of an age gluttonous beyond its powers of digestion. Our size has got beyond both our science and our conscience." That's a great quote from the author. So that perfectly sums up everything we've been saying. This change happened so rapidly and so fast, and it was so well thought out. They knew that the people would side with the Union for the Civil War. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were using what at that time was newly called psychology, and they're doing it today. Think about it. How can we revert back to a state of such bad racism when 150 years ago we literally already had a war over it? You know what I mean? It's foolish. It's completely foolish. How can you have a civil rights revolution in the middle of two moments where there's rampant race? You know what I mean? Like what is going on? It's ridiculous. Let's continue. Okay. In his radical attack on the new tyranny of wealth, Henry Demarest Lloyd did not speak for the generality of Americans or even for reformers. The public, he complained, was too ready to accept the values of the empire builders, and the reformers were too easily satisfied with superficial remedies. Well, isn't that true today, you guys? Most people just go along with it, and the rest of the people will settle for slavery. Wow. He found a contradiction between the interdependent nature of modern industrial society, in which everyone is living at the mercy of everyone else in a way entirely peculiar to our times, and the modern system of industrial control, in which a few monopolistic combinations rule society for their own selfish ends of profit and power. His solution lay in a vaguely conceived cooperative commonwealth, ruled by the masses of producers according to the principle of social interest. There is to be a people in industry, as in government. As a first power or public property, That is to say, public utilities such as railroads should be publicly owned and operated. In the following selection, his specific analysis of the Standard Oil Company and its use of the smokeless rebate as a device for destroying competition was presented as a case study of the false morality of the times, which encourages men to do each other to death, provided only the weapon be a bargain and the arena a market. Nice, this is going to be good. So he's talking about Rockefeller, of course. Standard Oil. Okay, with searching intelligence, indomitable will, and a conscience which makes religion, patriotism, and domestic virtues but subordinate paragraphs in a ritual of money worship, their mercantile mind flies its airline to business supremacy. That entirely modern social arrangement, the private ownership of public highways, has introduced a new weapon into business warfare, which means universal dominion to him who will use it with an iron hand. Wow. You can tell right off the bat, this first paragraph, this guy's telling you the truth. He's telling you for these people, consciousness, religion, patriotism, and domestic virtues are subordinate to a ritual of money worship. And I believe he means that literally. A literal ritual to money worship. A literal to the material. Worship to the material things. Okay, this weapon is the rebate. Smokeless, noiseless, invisible, of extraordinary range, and the deadliest gun known to commercial warfare. It is not a lawful weapon, like the explosive bullet. It is not recognized by the laws of war. It has to be used secretly. The apparatus of the rebate is so simple that it looks less like a destroying angel than any weapon of offense ever known. The whole battery consists only of a pen and ink and some paper. The discharge is but the making of an entry, but the signing of a check. But when the man who commands this simple enginery directs it against a business competitor, you can follow the track of wreckage like the path of a cyclone, by the ruins which lie bleaching in the air for years. The gentlemen who employ it give no evidence of being otherwise engaged than in their ordinary pursuits. They go about sedate and smiling, with seemingly friendly hands empty of all tools of death. But all about them, as they will, as if it were only by wish of theirs, which attendant spirits hasten to execute, rivals are blown out of the highways, busy mills, and refineries. They are turned to dust, heartbreak, and strong men go mad or commit suicide or surrender their persons and their property to the skillful artillerists. Yeah, so he's being a bit poetic, but he's talking about how this rebate system he's going to explain that Standard Oil used is what allowed Rockefeller to monopolize. And it's a trick. It's a trick like everything's a trick. Like, that's just the backbone of this world they've created, right? Shenanigans and tomfoolery. I mean, everything is a scam. Everything is built to break today. You know, we just live in this exaggerated version of the world they created back then. Okay. More than any others, the wrongs of the oil industry provoked the investigations by Congress from 1872 to 1887 and caused the establishment of the Interstate Commerce Commission. We talked about that. And more than any others, they have claimed the attention of the new law and the new court. The cases brought before it covered the oil business on practically every road of any importance in the United States. In New England, in the Middle States, the West, the South, the Pacific Coast, on the Great East and the West, trunk roads, the Pennsylvania, the Erie, the Baltimore, the Ohio, the New York Central, and all their allied railroad lines, on the transcontinental lines, the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, the Southern Pacific, on the Steamship and Railroad Association controlling the South and the Southwest. They show that from ocean to ocean, and from the Gulf of the St. Lawrence to the Gulf of Mexico, wherever the American citizen seeks an opening in this industry, he finds it, like the deer forest and grouse moors of the old country, protected by gamekeepers against him and the common herd. The terms in which the Commission have described the preferences given the oil combination are not ambiguous. Great difference in rates, unjust discrimination, intentional disregard of rights, unexcused, a vast discrepancy, enormous, illegal, excessive, extraordinary, forbidden by the Act to regulate commerce, so obvious and palpable a discrimination that no discussion of it is necessary, wholly indefensible, patent and provoking discriminations for which no rational excuse is suggested, obnoxious, disparity, absurd, inexcusable, gross disproportions and inequalities, long practice, the most unjust and injurious discrimination, and this discrimination inured mostly to the benefit of one powerful combination. Wow. This guy's emotional. He's revved up. This was what the Interstate Commerce Commission found all along the record from 1887 to 1893, when one of those who got the benefits so characterized was before the New York legislature in 1888. He said, quote, I know of no discrimination in the oil traffic of any kind since the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act, end quote. The smokeless rebate makes the secret of success in business to be not manufacture, but manufacture breaking down with a strong hand the true makers of things. To those who can get the rebate, it makes no difference who does the digging, building, mining, making, producing, the million forms of the wealth they covet to themselves. They need only get control of the roads. All that they want of the wealth of others can be switched off the highways into their hands. To succeed, ambitious men must make themselves refiners of freight rates, distillers of discriminations, owners not of lands, mines, and forests, not in the first place at least, but of the railway officials, through whose hands the produce must go to market. Builders not of manufactories, but of privileges, inventors only of schemes, to keep for themselves the middle of the road and both sides of it. Contrivers not of competition, but of ways to tax the property of their competitors into their pockets. They need not make money, they can take it from those who have made it. Wow. This is exactly what an impersonal market creates. So, when is this written? 1894. So from like 1870 to 1894, the Union, the North, these industrialists intentionally created this impersonal market. This impersonal market on which everybody was reliant. They destroyed self-sufficiency by literally destroying half the country. The half the country that was self-sufficient and Christian, they did away with. So now they have this full system of the impersonal market. And what do they do after the Civil War? They expand it as quickly as possible. They set up the government grants so much land to these railroad companies. I had a graphic in this book, but I won't look it up. But like I said, these railroad tracks that the federal government gave these companies were literally like the height of Massachusetts. Like that's how thick the line is going across the country. These giant corporations were giving so much sweeping power. And then when the people demanded a solution to, all the civil dispute, the government comes up with the Interstate Commerce Act. And now all of a sudden, the government and the industrialists have complete control over the buying and selling of goods, right? So what this author is saying is that you don't have to control the manufacturer. You don't have to control the retailer. Just control the roads. Be the middleman. That's what this is saying. He's saying that because of the Interstate Commerce Act, the people in the boardrooms, the directors, the trusts, the holding companies, the politicians, the senators, the representatives, all these people, these middlemen are making so much money hand over foot by controlling the roads, by controlling the interstate commerce, with bills literally called the Interstate Commerce Act. So once again, you see the wishes of the American people being granted only to be used against them. Damn. That's rough. All right, let's read a little bit of Milltown, the Factory Grind. This was written by Carol D. Wright from Fall River, Lowell and Lawrence, 1882. So I think we're going to get a little taste of what it was like working in Fall River back then. This would be the environment, like the stereotypical mill, right, with the triple-deckers where 3 generations of one family live in one triple-decker, 3-decker apartment, and they all work at the same factory, and the factory owns the house, the factory owns the market. They're basically like little communist corporations. So let's read about it. One of the Fall River operatives summarized the feeling throughout the city in the following: bad cotton, stealing time, and a constant and steady grind constitute the 3 greatest complaints in Fall River today. Another, commenting on the above-mentioned causes, could think of none others of moment, and thought that the agent would not find many who could. For, said he, they only speak of that which hurts them just before they go home to supper. When it came to the question of entering a complaint, they agreed that the answer invariably given was, quote, there is no redress here, and no appeal. The byword is, if you don't like it, get out, end quote. Another operative said, quote, the former feeling of bitterness between the North and South is but an example of the feeling twixt employed and employer in Fall River, end quote. Wow. So the feeling between North and South during the Civil War is equivalent to the feeling between employer and employee. Sounds a bit like slavery to me, doesn't it? When the manufacturers were visited, the question was asked in regard to the existing state of affairs. Why is it that the operatives of Lowell and Lawrence are apparently so well contented, and those of Fall River apparently so discontented? This was supplemented by the query, have you heard of any complaints from your operatives during the past 4 months? The majority answered in particular, their conclusion being that it had been quieter during the last 4 months than for some time past. One treasurer said further, quote, the discontent among the Fall River operatives is the outgrowth of the abnormal increase of the mills in 1871. We have the scum of the English and Irish in our midst. They brought their antagonistic notions with them. We have... What? So, hold on. I'm from Massachusetts. I grew up right next to where they're talking about. I'm Irish. I'm Italian. I literally came over here as the scum they're referring to. Where are my reparations? Right? You don't hear me complaining. Let's read this again. We have the scum of the English and Irish in our midst. They brought their antagonistic notions with them. We never employ a man who belongs to a trades union if we know it. We root them out whenever we find them. We manage more help in Fall River than they do in any other city. 2 years ago, the operatives went out on a strike. The trouble was that we discharged an obnoxious spinner. Look at the spinners union. Like a spinning jenny. Its officers are all blacklisted men and cannot get work in any of the mills. Its secretary gets $15 a week to look out for the interest of the union and to stir up trouble. He is a good enough fellow, and we understand him and he us. The president and treasurer, after being blacklisted, received grants of $100 each from the union's treasury and started rum shops, and the spinners patronized them. Another treasurer said, there are plenty of complaints all the time. Last August, the spinners protested against the twist we insisted should be given on the yarn, as it somewhat reduced their wages, and their cry was, take out the drag. They are never content unless they are complaining. Now they complain because we have a sampler who examines such bale of cotton we purchase in order to ascertain if it is like the sample. So, just atrocious conditions, dude. Just basically slaves. Literally slaves. Wow. Here's another good one called Debt and Taxes, Loss of the Farmer's Independence. This is written by William Peffer, 1891. Okay. This one's going to be probably pretty shocking. By 1891, the farmer's independence. Oh boy. Okay, so 100 years ago, 90% of our population lived on farms, and transportation was so expensive that surplus wheat and corn had no market. That surplus wheat and corn had no market value 50 miles away from a market town. Now, great cities have grown up. The market has been distributed all over the country, and distance is practically annihilated. From a small area along the Atlantic coast, we have spread across the continent, and we travel in palace cars from Boston to San Francisco in less than 6 working days. We have about 5 million farms, though less than half of our people live on them. They are valued at something over $11,000 million. 10 years ago, the value of farm machinery was $406 million, and our farm livestock on hand was worth $1 billion. Wow. Our average annual production of wheat the last 10 years has been about 500 million bushels, and of corn we raise nearly 4 times that much. Learning, enterprise, and invention have added 75% to the productive power of the people in the last 50 years. The opening of the Suez Canal shortened the distance between Bombay and Liverpool 10,000 miles, and cheapened transportation 50%. Wheat grown in India can be landed in Britain for 50 cents a bushel total cost. Many men now living remember when wheat, 100 miles west of our large cities on the seaboard, was valueless except for home use, its carriage that distance being worth its full value in the market. 1 man and 3 horses plow as much ground with 1 plow as 2 men and 4 horses did with 2 plows formerly. 1 man with a seed drill will sow seed on twice as much ground as he could if sowing broadcast by hand. 1 man with a self-binder will put in sheaf as much wheat as 12 persons did before the reaper was invented. On the whole, 1 man does as much work on the farm now as 2 men did under the old regime, and more in some lines of work. The farmer produces as much grain to the acre, raises as many cattle, hogs, sheep, and horses, works as hard and steadily as he did then, but is he gaining? Has he saved anything? On the contrary, he is not in debt and falling behind. Oh, is he not in debt and falling behind? Is he not losing rather than gaining ground compared with his fellow men? His crops have not fallen off, but their value in the market is less by 30 to 50% than they were a dozen years ago. And before that time, he is paying all the way from 8 to 40% for the use of money, money which goes up in value while his produce goes down. His taxes have not diminished a penny, while his crops are cut short one half in paying power. The census reports have shown well for the farmer. In number and value, farms have increased. Farm implements have been multiplied many times, and livestock increases yearly. But the average farmer is not growing richer. In the last 38 years, railroad interest in the United States have developed 1,580%, banking 918%, and manufacturers 408%, while agriculture has not gone beyond 200%. He plows and sows and reaps with machines. A machine cuts his wheat and puts it in a sheaf, and steam drives his thrashers. He may read the morning paper while he plows, and sit under an awning while he reaps. Surely, considering all these things and in view of them, the farmer ought to be in his best estate, but he is not. He ought to be the richest, the most happy, the most influential and powerful citizen in the Republic, who is bold enough to assert that he is. Ends with that question. Wow, that perfectly sums up what happens after the Civil War is won by the Union. It's perfect. That was the whole goal, was to kill this type of person. He's saying pretty much pre-Civil War, the farmer ought to be the richest, the most happy, the most influential, and the most powerful citizen in the Republic as a class, right? The ruling farming agrarian class, like it was in the Confederacy. That was the ruling class. And when you look at the two cultures, slavery being a separate topic, and you look at where they would have taken the country and what principles they would have moved into the future with, and we would not be in the situation we find ourselves in today had the Confederacy won, in my opinion. So that's pretty crazy. And you can tell these three industries he mentioned, railroad, banking, and manufacturers, just skyrocketed. It's too bad. Let's see what we got here. Okay, so I guess we'll wrap up with Teddy Roosevelt speaking here. This is called Nation and Corporation, the Square Deal. Interesting, the square, right? Freemasons. He was a Freemason. It's in the Bible behind me. Teddy Roosevelt. Okay. Chance gave Theodore Roosevelt the title of president in 1901. The irrepressible Teddy soon demonstrated his resolution to make the most of his opportunity. He used the great resources of his office to the full extent, extending his control over the National Republican Party, and in making the White House a bully pulpit, as he called it. At last, it seemed the nation would come to grips with the pressing problems of the industrial order that had evolved since the Civil War. The Republican Roosevelt had no fixed program of reform to offer the country. His square deal aimed broadly at a balance of the major economic interest, business, labor, farmers, consumers, under the firm, neutral, yet limited control of the federal authority. So, the bully pulpit. You know, that basically means, I'm pretty sure that means when the politician is both like angry and forthcoming at the pulpit, but at the same time has that spiritual, religious, loving aspect to him. Plays both sides of the field, I think. And kind of like a Trump, right? So Civil War happens, then all this rapid change. Nobody can even comprehend what the heck is going on. People today don't even understand the Act of 1871 or Admiralty law or what corporations really are. So people back then didn't understand it much either. And Teddy Roosevelt is really the first one of these actors to come along and woo the people, right? Totally wooed the people. Kind of like Trump. Let's read what he had to say. And we'll wrap it up there, and then we'll talk about next episode. Okay. In our industrial and social system, the interests of all men are so closely intertwined that in an immense majority of cases, a straight-dealing man who by his efficiency, by his ingenuity and industry, benefits himself, must also benefit others. Wow. So that statement would not have been true pre-Civil War. So he's saying our industrial and social system is so intertwined that every deal affects one another. Like literally, it's the hive mind. It's the capstone of the pyramid. It's the all-seeing eye. The hive, literal hive mind is a way you can look at it. I mean, that's what we're living in today almost. And, you can see it just taking shape. The impersonal markets, they just interconnected everybody into a system of slavery. It's fascinating. Let's continue. Normally, the man of great productive capacity who becomes rich by guiding the labor of many other men does so by enabling them to produce more than they could produce without his guidance. And both he and they share in the benefit, which comes also to the public at large. The superficial fact that the sharing may be unequal must never blind us to the underlying fact that there is this sharing, and that the benefit comes in some degree to each man concerned. Taken as a whole, we must all go up or down together. Yet, while not merely admitting, but insisting upon this, it is also true that where there is no governmental restraint or supervision, some of the exceptional men use their energies not in ways that are for the common good, but in ways which tell against the common good. You don't say. The fortunes amassed through corporate organization are now so large and vest such power in those that wield them as to make it a matter of necessity to give to the sovereign, that is, to the government, which represents the people as a whole, some effective power of supervision over their corporate use. In order to ensure a healthy social and industrial life, every big corporation should be held responsible by and be accountable to some sovereign strong enough to control its conduct. I am in no sense hostile to corporations. This is an age of combination, and any effort to prevent all combination will be not only useless, but in the end, vicious. Sound familiar, you guys? This is the same crap they talk about today with the left-right. Because of the contempt for law, which the failure to enforce law inevitably produces, we should, moreover, recognize in cordial and ample fashion the immense good effected by the corporate agencies in a country such as ours, and the wealth of intellect, energy, and fidelity devoted to their service, and therefore normally to the service of the public. By their officers and directors, the corporation has come to stay, just as a trade union has come to stay. Each can do and has done great good. Each should be favored so long as it does good, but each should be sharply checked where it acts against law and justice. Pretty much saying this is here to stay. And look at it, we still are dealing with the same crap today. Unbelievable. So long as the finances of the nation are kept upon an honest basis, no other question of internal economy with which the Congress has the power to deal begins to approach an importance of matter of endeavoring to secure proper industrial conditions under which the individuals, and especially the great corporations, doing an interstate business are to act. What a lie. What a lie. The finances of the nation could not be less important to anybody in our politics. I feel like here's the way it works. Honestly, our system, our fiat system of currency, I feel like it's not eternal. It has a set time span. It has a life, right? And for all of these politicians, the game is to get in and to launder and steal as much money as you possibly can from the taxpayers and then get out. That's what it seems like. I can't think of another reason they would give money to gender studies in Pakistan. We are like almost $30 trillion in debt. There's absolutely zero regard for the debt. And there never has been. There's never been regard for it since the Civil War. Well, there was a little fight after the Civil War, but yeah, by 1933, it was all over. Complete fiat currency system. So yeah, Teddy is this bully pulpit, this character, this lovable teddy bear guy who can go up on stage and woo both sides of the aisle. And really, this is sort of the beginning of the left-right paradigm political theater show. Of course, it always existed, but now with the age of transportation complete, the industrial age complete, the manufacturing age complete, and the impersonal market age complete, all of these, required steps, we now live in this society by the 1900s where you can read the newspaper every morning. You can get the news. You can get information from the West Coast in 6 days or by telegraph even in a minute. The world has become very connected by this time. So people can pay attention to politics at the same rate as the rest of their countrymen. And that's really what happens with Teddy Roosevelt. He becomes idolized, right? Basically becomes worshipped and distracts everybody with political theater and pretty much just is the opium for the masses after the 30, 40 years of insane change that happened after the Civil War. So when we get to next episode, we'll probably read some of War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. We're going to talk about the Titanic, the Federal Reserve, FDR, removing the gold. We'll talk about, of course, the World Wars and the UN. We'll probably get up to today. And then we'll do some sort of wrap-up episode to tie it all together. So yeah, what are the themes of what we just went over? The destruction of true independence, the destruction of the agrarian, Jeffersonian, Southern lifestyle, where men were not reliant on the government, men were not reliant on markets, people were self-sufficient, but they were also communal, and they were mostly Christian, and society was a lot slower for the South. We learned that the North defeated them, and the North's lifestyle, as you can see on your screen, was a lot different. Industrious, enlightened, reasoned, ecumenical, godless in reality, and home of the corporation and the bank and the manufacturing. And that's really the story of today's episode, is how that blew up, how that expanded, and how they used the corporation not only as a way to make money, but as a way to govern. So we became governed by the corporation of the District of Columbia, the United States Corporation, and we became, sufficient? We required them, right? The impersonal markets. We no longer are self-sufficient. We require all of these corporations for our everyday needs and our everyday goods. So you can see, just like today, these are the seeds of today's society were definitely planted in the blood-soaked soil of the Civil War. That's what we've been learning about today. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you very much.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.